I thought the dizziness was just old age catching up with me. I thought the memory lapses were stress from my husband's recent passing. I never imagined that the sweet daughter-in-law who brought me chamomile tea every evening was slowly poisoning me with prescription sedatives she'd been stealing from the nursing home where she worked. It wasn't until federal agents surrounded her house at 5 in the morning that I realized how close I'd come to becoming another statistic in her deadly scheme. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Grace Phillips, and 6 months ago, I would have sworn on my late husband Robert's grave that my daughter-in-law Carmen was the most caring person I'd ever known. She moved in with me after Robert died last spring, insisting I shouldn't be alone in the big Victorian house we'd called home for 43 years. At 72, I was grateful for the company, especially from someone who seemed to genuinely care about my well-being. Carmen had always been the perfect addition to our family. When my son Daniel brought her home 8 years ago, Robert and I fell in love with her immediately. She was warm, attentive, and had this way of making everyone feel special. She worked as a certified nursing assistant at Willowbrook Care Center, and her dedication to elderly patients seemed to extend naturally to me after Robert's funeral. Those first few weeks after moving in, Carmen transformed our evening routine. She'd brew me a cup of chamomile tea every night at exactly 8 o'clock, sitting with me while I sipped it and listening to stories about Robert or my garden. She'd rub my shoulders when they ached, remind me to take my blood pressure medication, and tuck me into bed like I was her own mother. I felt so loved, so cared for, that I ignored the small voice in my head that wondered why I felt so tired all the time. The drowsiness started gradually. At first, I attributed it to grief. Losing Robert after 4 decades of marriage had left me feeling hollow and exhausted. When Carmen would bring me that steaming mug of tea with its soothing honey and lavender scent, I welcomed the way it made my eyelids heavy. Sleep was an escape from the ache of missing my husband, and I was grateful that Carmen seemed to understand my need for rest. But as weeks turned into months, the fatigue became something else entirely. I'd wake up feeling groggy and disoriented, like I was swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark pool. Simple tasks that had never challenged me before suddenly felt overwhelming. I'd find myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker, unable to remember what I'd intended to do. I'd lose track of conversations mid-sentence, watching Carmen's lips move while the words seemed to dissolve before reaching my ears. Carmen was always there with gentle concern, guiding me back to my chair, bringing me that nightly tea, suggesting I might want to see a doctor about my senior moments. She spoke to me in the same patient, condescending tone I'd heard her use with the dementia patients at Willowbrook, and something about it made my skin crawl, though I couldn't articulate why. The memory problems were the most frightening part. I'd always prided myself on my sharp mind. I could remember phone numbers from the 1980s, recite entire poems I'd learned in school, and never needed to write down grocery lists. But suddenly, I couldn't remember if I'd eaten lunch or whether I'd already taken my medication. Carmen started organizing my pills in a weekly dispenser, counting them out each morning with theatrical care while I watched through a haze of confusion. One evening in late October, as Carmen settled beside me with my usual tea, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Her hands were steady, professional, as she stirred the honey, but there was something in her expression that I'd never seen before. A calculating look, like she was measuring something. When she handed me the mug, our fingers brushed, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. That night, I forced myself to stay awake after drinking the tea, fighting against the wave of drowsiness that crashed over me within minutes. Through sheer willpower, I remained conscious long enough to hear Carmen moving around downstairs. Her footsteps weren't the casual sounds of someone tidying up for the night. They were purposeful, methodical. I heard her opening and closing drawers, the soft beep of the house phone being used, and what sounded like papers rustling. When I woke the next morning, I felt different, still groggy, but with a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. I made my way downstairs to find Carmen already dressed for work, humming as she prepared my breakfast. She looked up with that practiced smile, the one I was beginning to recognize as slightly too wide, held a moment too long. I decided to test something. Over the following days, I began paying closer attention to my symptoms, keeping a mental log of when they occurred and what preceded them. The pattern was unmistakable. The drowsiness and confusion always intensified within 30 minutes of drinking Carmen's specially prepared tea. On the rare occasions when I went to bed without it, claiming I wasn't thirsty, I slept more fitfully but woke feeling significantly more alert. My suspicions crystallized one afternoon when I was supposed to be napping. I heard Carmen on the phone in the kitchen, her voice lower than usual. I crept to the top of the stairs, pressing myself against the wall to listen. She was speaking to someone about the old lady and mentioned something about adjusting the dosage and keeping her compliant. The clinical detachment in her tone made my blood run cold. That evening, when Carmen brought my tea, I made a decision that would change everything. I accepted the mug with my usual grateful smile, raised it to my lips, and pretended to drink while actually letting the liquid pool in my mouth. When Carmen turned to adjust the television volume, I quickly spat the tea into a tissue I'd hidden in my sleeve. The bitter, medicinal taste that lingered on my tongue confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. For the first time in months, I stayed fully alert after bedtime. I listened as Carmen went through her nightly routine, but this time I was conscious enough to hear things I'd missed before. She made several phone calls, speaking in hushed tones about maintaining the timeline and preparing for the next phase. She spent over an hour in Robert's old study, where she'd claimed to be organizing his papers to help me with estate matters. The next morning, I woke with the clearest head I'd had since she moved in. Colors seemed brighter, sounds sharper, and for the first time, I felt truly afraid. I realized that Carmen had been systematically drugging me for months, and I had no idea why or what she planned to do next. The woman I'd trusted with my life, my home, and my vulnerability was not who she pretended to be. I knew I needed help, but I also knew I had to be careful. Carmen monitored my activities closely, claiming it was for my own safety. She'd convinced Daniel that I was developing early-stage dementia, showing him examples of my confusion and forgetfulness that I now realized she'd been orchestrating. My own son believed I was losing my mind, and Carmen had positioned herself as my devoted caregiver. That day, while Carmen was at work, I forced myself to think clearly about my situation. I searched through my purse and found my cell phone, which I hadn't used in weeks. Carmen had convinced me that technology was too confusing in my condition, and had taken over all my communication with the outside world. My hands shook as I scrolled through my contacts, trying to decide who to call. I thought about contacting Daniel, but I knew Carmen had already poisoned his perception of me. Any accusations I made would sound like the paranoid delusions of a woman losing her grip on reality. I considered calling my sister Margaret in Arizona, but what could she do from 2,000 miles away? I needed someone local. Someone who knew me well enough to recognize that I wasn't suffering from dementia. That's when I remembered Dr. Elizabeth Henley, my longtime physician who had retired 2 years earlier. Beth had been not just my doctor but a friend for over 15 years. She knew my medical history, my mental acuity, and most importantly, she knew me well enough to distinguish between genuine cognitive decline and something else entirely. I found her personal number in my old address book and dialed with trembling fingers. Beth answered on the third ring, and the warmth in her voice when she recognized mine nearly made me cry. I'd been so isolated for months, surrounded by Carmen's false concern, that hearing genuine care in someone's voice was overwhelming.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I told her I needed to see her urgently, that something was terribly wrong but I couldn't discuss it over the phone. Without hesitation, she invited me to her home that afternoon. Getting there without Carmen's knowledge required more cunning than I'd used in years. I told the neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, that I was feeling dizzy and needed a ride to urgent care. She drove me to Beth's house without question, and I promised to call when I needed a ride home. Beth took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. In her living room, surrounded by the familiar scent of her lavender garden and the comfort of her presence, I told her everything. The months of increasing drowsiness, the memory problems, the strange taste in my tea, and Carmen's suspicious behavior. Beth listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When I finished, Beth was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me a question that chilled me to the bone. Grace, have you been having any problems with your finances? Any unexplained withdrawals or changes to your accounts? My stomach dropped. I realized I hadn't looked at my bank statements in months. Carmen had taken over managing my bills, claiming the paperwork was too stressful for me in my grief. Beth drove me to my bank, where we requested statements for the past 6 months. What we discovered made me physically ill. There had been numerous withdrawals, transfers, and changes to my accounts that I had no memory of authorizing. Thousands of dollars had been moved around, and most alarmingly, I'd apparently signed documents making Carmen a joint account holder and beneficiary of my life insurance policy. The bank manager, recognizing the signs of elder financial abuse, immediately flagged my accounts and provided us with copies of all the documentation. My signature appeared on dozens of forms, but as I studied them more closely, I could see subtle differences that suggested forgery or that I'd signed them while heavily impaired. Beth insisted we go to the hospital for blood tests. She explained that if Carmen had been drugging me, there might still be traces in my system that could be detected. The emergency room physician, a colleague of Beth's, agreed to run a comprehensive toxicology screen after hearing our concerns. The wait for results was agonizing. Beth stayed with me the entire time, and I found myself clinging to her presence like a lifeline. For months, I'd felt like I was losing my mind, questioning my own perceptions and memories. Having someone believe me, someone who could see that this wasn't normal aging or grief-related decline, was validating in a way I hadn't expected. When the results came back, they confirmed our worst fears. My blood showed significant levels of lorazepam, a powerful sedative that I'd never been prescribed. The doctor explained that the levels suggested consistent dosing over an extended period, which would account for all my symptoms. The cumulative effect of months of regular sedation could have been fatal, especially at my age, and with my heart condition. Armed with this evidence, Beth convinced me that we needed to involve law enforcement immediately. She called a detective she knew personally, someone who specialized in elder abuse cases. Detective Maria Santos agreed to meet us at the hospital that evening, and when she arrived, I could see why Beth trusted her. She had kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor that made me feel like she'd take my situation seriously. Detective Santos listened to my story with the same attention Beth had shown, asking detailed questions about Carmen's behavior, the timeline of my symptoms, and the financial irregularities we'd discovered. She examined the bank documents and medical records with growing concern, making notes and asking me to sign forms authorizing a formal investigation. What she told me next made my blood run cold. She said that cases like mine were more common than most people realized, and that caregivers who drugged their victims often had more sinister motives than simple theft. Sometimes they were preparing their victims for more serious harm, including murder, especially when life insurance policies were involved. Detective Santos arranged for me to stay at Beth's house that night while she worked on obtaining warrants. She explained that returning home could be dangerous if Carmen suspected I was becoming aware of what was happening. The thought of sleeping in my own bed, the bed I'd shared with Robert for 4 decades, now filled me with terror. That night at Beth's, lying in her guest room, I couldn't stop thinking about all the signs I'd missed or dismissed. Carmen's insistence on taking over my care so completely. The way she'd isolated me from friends and family, claiming they were too much stimulation for my condition. How she'd positioned herself as the only person who truly understood my needs. It was a classic pattern of abuse, and I'd fallen for it completely. The next morning, Detective Santos called with an update that made my hands shake. The investigation into Carmen had revealed something shocking. She was already under federal investigation for stealing prescription drugs from Willowbrook Care Center. Apparently, she'd been diverting medications meant for elderly patients for months, and the DEA had been building a case against her. Even more disturbing, they discovered that Carmen had been involved in the suspicious deaths of 2 previous patients whose families had reported similar symptoms before the elderly individuals passed away unexpectedly. Both cases had been ruled natural deaths at the time, but they were now being reopened in light of the new evidence. Detective Santos explained that federal agents would be executing search and arrest warrants at my house that morning. They wanted me to stay away until the scene was secure, but they also needed me to provide a detailed inventory of any valuables or important documents that might have been tampered with. As I sat in Beth's kitchen, sipping coffee that tasted pure and clean for the first time in months, I tried to process the magnitude of what Carmen had done. She hadn't just been stealing money or drugs. She'd been systematically destroying my autonomy, my health, and possibly planning to kill me. The woman who'd comforted me through Robert's funeral, who'd held my hand while I cried, who'd called me Mom with such apparent affection, had been my predator all along. The irony wasn't lost on me that Carmen worked at a nursing home, caring for vulnerable elderly people during the day while coming home to slowly poison one at night. I wondered how many other victims there might be, how many families had lost loved ones to her calculated cruelty without ever knowing the truth. Beth held my hand as we waited for the call that would tell us it was safe to return to my house. She'd been making calls of her own, contacting colleagues who specialized in toxicology and elder abuse recovery. She assured me that with proper medical care and time, the effects of the prolonged drugging would fade completely. My mind would clear, my energy would return, and I would be myself again. When Detective Santos finally called to say the warrants had been executed, her voice was grim. They'd found a cache of stolen medications hidden in Carmen's bedroom, including the lorazepam she'd been using to drug me. They'd also discovered detailed notes about my daily routines, my medical conditions, and what appeared to be a timeline for gradually increasing the dosage of sedatives. Most chilling of all, they'd found life insurance documents and what looked like draft obituaries for me, written in Carmen's handwriting. She'd been planning my death, making it look like a natural progression of my supposed dementia. The papers detailed how she would present my decline to Daniel and other family members, positioning herself as the grieving daughter-in-law who'd done everything possible to care for me in my final months. Carmen had been arrested at Willowbrook as she arrived for her shift, federal agents surrounding her before she could enter the building. Detective Santos said she'd maintained her innocence initially, claiming she'd only been trying to help me sleep better because of my grief. But when confronted with the evidence of her theft from the nursing home and the suspicious deaths of other patients, she'd requested a lawyer and stopped talking. The news that Carmen was in federal custody should have brought me relief, but instead, I felt a deep sadness that surprised me. For months, despite the fear and confusion, part of me had genuinely cared for her. I'd believed her tears when she talked about wanting to take care of me like I was family. I'd thought her devotion was real, even as my body was telling me something was wrong. Beth drove me home that afternoon, staying close as I walked through rooms that felt different now. The kitchen, where Carmen had prepared my nightly tea, looked sinister in the afternoon light. The living room, where we'd sat together every evening, felt contaminated by the knowledge of her true intentions. Even my bedroom, where she'd tucked me in with such apparent care, now seemed like a crime scene. The federal agents had been thorough but respectful, leaving my belongings largely undisturbed while removing evidence. They'd taken the tea tin from my kitchen, several cups that might have residue, and all of Carmen's personal belongings from the room she'd claimed as her own. Detective Santos had left her card and a packet of resources for elder abuse victims, along with contact information for counselors who specialized in trauma recovery. That first night alone in my house since Carmen's arrest was the longest I'd experienced in years. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. I'd grown so accustomed to her presence, even knowing now that it had been malevolent, that the silence felt overwhelming. I found myself checking the locks multiple times, looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I didn't sleep much, but when I finally dozed near dawn, my dreams were clear and vivid for the first time in months. I dreamed of Robert, not the confused, fragmented memories I'd been having, but sharp, detailed recollections of our life together. I dreamed of gardening in our backyard, of cooking Sunday dinners, of conversations we'd had about growing old together. It was as if Carmen's drugs had been suppressing not just my consciousness, but my connection to my own memories. When I woke that morning, I felt more like myself than I had since Robert's death. The fog that had surrounded my thoughts was lifting, and I could think clearly about practical matters for the first time in months. I made a list of everything I needed to do: contact my bank about the fraudulent transactions, change all my passwords and security codes, call Daniel to explain what had happened, and most importantly, reclaim control of my own life. The phone call to Daniel was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. He'd been so convinced that I was developing dementia that hearing the truth about Carmen left him speechless. He kept saying he should have known, should have protected me, should have questioned Carmen's version of events. I could hear the guilt in his voice, and my heart ached for him almost as much as it did for myself. Daniel drove down from Portland that afternoon, and when he walked through the front door, he looked at me with such relief and regret that we both started crying. He held me the way he used to when he was a child and had been hurt, and I realized that Carmen had stolen not just from me but from our relationship. She'd convinced him that his mother was disappearing, that the woman who'd raised him was fading away, and he'd been grieving my loss while I was still alive. We spent hours talking, piecing together the timeline of Carmen's deception. Daniel told me about conversations they'd had where she'd expressed concern about my episodes and suggested he might want to start thinking about assisted living options. She'd been laying the groundwork for my complete removal from my own life, positioning herself as the reluctant but necessary decision-maker for my care. The financial investigation revealed the full scope of Carmen's theft. Over 6 months, she'd stolen nearly $40,000 from my accounts, using forged signatures and taking advantage of my drugged state to authorize transfers. She'd also attempted to change the beneficiary on my life insurance policy to herself, claiming I'd wanted to show my appreciation for her care. The federal prosecutor assigned to Carmen's case contacted me personally to explain that she was facing charges not just for elder abuse and theft, but for drug trafficking and potentially multiple counts of murder. The investigation into the previous deaths at Willowbrook had uncovered evidence that Carmen had been systematically overdosing patients and stealing their medications for months before targeting me. As weeks passed and my system cleared of the sedatives, I began to understand the full extent of what Carmen had stolen from me. It wasn't just money or my sense of security. She'd stolen months of my life, my autonomy, my connection to my own memories of Robert. She'd made me doubt my own mind, question my own perceptions, and feel helpless in ways I'd never experienced before. But she'd also revealed something about myself that I hadn't known existed. When faced with a threat I couldn't fully understand or articulate, some part of my mind had kept working, kept questioning, kept fighting. The woman who'd figured out that her tea was being drugged, who'd found the courage to call for help, who'd insisted on medical tests despite months of gaslighting, was stronger than I'd ever realized. The federal trial was still months away, but Detective Santos kept me informed about the progress of the investigation. Carmen had eventually confessed to drugging me, but maintained that she'd never intended to kill me, only to keep me manageable while she accessed my finances. She claimed the deaths at Willowbrook were accidents, that she'd only been trying to ease the suffering of terminal patients. The prosecutor didn't believe her explanations, and neither did I. The detailed notes they'd found in her room, the draft obituaries, the timeline for increasing my medication, all pointed to a calculated plan to end my life once she'd extracted everything of value from my accounts. What haunted me most wasn't the betrayal, or even the attempt on my life. It was the realization of how vulnerable I'd been, how easily I'd accepted her care without questioning her motives. I'd been so grateful for her attention, so desperate not to be alone in my grief, that I'd ignored every warning sign my body had tried to give me. Beth helped me understand that this was part of Carmen's skill as a predator. She'd identified me as an ideal victim, recently widowed, financially comfortable, socially isolated, and trusting. She'd moved into my life during my most vulnerable moment and systematically exploited every weakness she could find. But I'd survived. Against odds that I was only beginning to understand, I'd recognized the danger and found the courage to act. The tea that was supposed to have made me compliant had instead awakened my survival instincts. The isolation that was supposed to have made me helpless had forced me to rely on my own judgment. And the trust that was supposed to have made me an easy victim had ultimately led me to the right people who could help. As I sat in my kitchen that morning, 6 months after waking up alone and confused for the last time, I raised my cup of coffee in a silent toast to my own resilience. The woman who'd survived Carmen's calculated cruelty was not the same woman who'd welcomed her into this house with open arms. I was harder now, more suspicious, slower to trust. But I was also more aware of my own strength, more confident in my own judgment, and more determined than ever to live the rest of my life on my own terms. The FBI had knocked on Carmen's door at dawn, but they'd also knocked on mine in a different way. They'd awakened me to truths about myself I'd never known I possessed, and for that awakening, despite everything it had cost me, I found myself oddly grateful. Carmen would spend the rest of her life in federal prison, but I would spend the rest of mine free from her influence, clear-minded and strong. In the end, despite her best efforts, I had won. The morning after Carmen's arrest, I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows with a clarity I hadn't experienced in over half a year. My mind felt sharp, almost hyper-aware, as if someone had adjusted the focus on a camera that had been blurry for months. I could hear birds singing outside, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, even the subtle creaking of the old house settling in the morning warmth. These were sounds that had been muffled by Carmen's chemical fog, and their return felt like a small miracle. I made my way downstairs, each step steadier than it had been in months, and found myself standing in the kitchen where so much of my torment had taken place. The counter where Carmen had prepared my nightly doses of sedatives looked innocent in the morning light, just ordinary granite and wood. But I could still see her hands moving with practiced precision, stirring honey into chamomile tea while calculating how much poison my body could absorb without obvious symptoms. The federal agents had taken the tea tin as evidence, along with the specific mug Carmen always used for my bedtime drinks. I opened the cabinet where they'd been stored and saw the empty spaces like missing teeth in an otherwise normal row of dishes. It struck me how something as simple as a ceramic mug could become an instrument of such deliberate harm, how the ritual of evening tea that should have been comforting had been weaponized against me. I called Beth to let her know I was feeling better, and she invited me to join her for lunch at the small cafe we used to frequent before Carmen convinced me I was too confused to drive safely. The prospect of navigating traffic and making decisions about food felt overwhelming at first, then exhilarating. For months, Carmen had made every choice for me, from what I ate to when I slept, to which television programs I watched. The idea of ordering my own meal felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity. The drive to meet Beth was my first time behind the wheel since early in Carmen's stay. She'd convinced me that my reflexes were too slow, my judgment too impaired, to operate a vehicle safely. Now, with my mind clear, I realized she'd been systematically stripping away every form of independence I possessed. The car responded normally to my hands on the steering wheel, the traffic patterns made perfect sense, and I felt a rush of confidence that brought tears to my eyes. Beth was waiting at our usual table by the window, and when she saw me walk in unassisted, without the shuffling gait I developed during my months of sedation, her face lit up with relief. She stood to hug me, and I could feel how much my deterioration had worried her. Over soup and sandwiches, we talked about the investigation and what would come next, but mostly we talked about how good it felt to have a normal conversation again. I told her about waking up that morning and remembering details about Robert that had been hazy for months. His laugh, the way he hummed while shaving, the particular spot in our garden where he liked to sit with his morning coffee. Carmen's drugs hadn't just clouded my daily thinking. They'd created a barrier between me and my most precious memories. Having them return felt like being reunited with old friends I'd thought were lost forever. Beth explained more about the medical aspects of what I'd endured. Chronic sedation at my age could have caused permanent cognitive damage, or even death from respiratory depression. The fact that Carmen had been increasing the dosage gradually meant my body had developed some tolerance, which probably saved my life. But it also meant that by the time of her arrest, I was dangerously close to a fatal overdose. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, called that afternoon to schedule a meeting. She wanted to prepare me for what would be a complex legal process, with Carmen facing charges in multiple jurisdictions for various crimes. The case against her was strong, Walsh assured me, but it would require my testimony about the months of abuse I'd suffered. When I met with Walsh 2 days later in her downtown office, I was struck by her combination of professional competence and genuine empathy. She'd prosecuted elder abuse cases before and understood the particular psychological damage that came from being victimized by someone you trusted completely. She explained that Carmen's defense team would likely try to portray her actions as misguided caregiving rather than deliberate harm. Walsh showed me photographs of evidence collected from my house, including the notebook where Carmen had recorded my daily routines and reactions to different doses of medication. Seeing my life reduced to clinical observations written in Carmen's neat handwriting was deeply disturbing. She'd noted when I seemed too alert and needed adjustment, when I asked too many questions and required redirection, when I showed signs of suspicion that needed to be managed. The notebook also contained what appeared to be a timeline for my expected decline. Carmen had projected that within another month, I would be considered incompetent to manage my own affairs. Shortly after that, according to her notes, I would likely suffer a natural death from complications related to my supposed dementia. The coldness of her planning was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Walsh explained that the investigation into Carmen's activities at Willowbrook Care Center had uncovered even more disturbing evidence. Security cameras had captured her diverting medications meant for patients, and several family members had come forward with concerns about their loved ones' unexpected deaths. The pattern was consistent. Patients who had been stable would suddenly decline rapidly after Carmen began working their floor. One family had requested an independent autopsy after their father died unexpectedly, and the results showed lethal levels of medications he'd never been prescribed. That death was now being investigated as homicide, and investigators suspected there might be others. Carmen hadn't just been stealing drugs for financial gain. She'd been using them to kill vulnerable patients, possibly to cover her tracks, or simply because she enjoyed the power over life and death. The scope of Carmen's crimes was expanding daily as more evidence came to light. Financial investigators had found that she'd been forging signatures and manipulating bank accounts for multiple elderly victims, not just me. She'd perfected a system of identifying vulnerable targets, gaining their trust, then systematically draining their resources while keeping them too sedated to understand what was happening. Detective Santos contacted me regularly with updates about the investigation. Carmen had been denied bail due to the flight risk and the severity of the charges against her. She was being held in federal detention, while prosecutors in 3 different states coordinated their cases. The evidence against her was so overwhelming that her attorney was already discussing the possibility of a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty. I struggled with mixed emotions about the legal proceedings. Part of me wanted Carmen to face the full consequences of her actions, to be held accountable for every life she damaged or destroyed. But another part of me just wanted the nightmare to be over, to move forward without having to relive the trauma repeatedly in courtrooms and depositions. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to evaluate Carmen for the prosecution, contacted me to discuss the psychological aspects of the case. She explained that Carmen displayed characteristics of what experts called angel of death behavior, a phenomenon where healthcare workers systematically harm or kill patients under their care. These individuals often appeared to be model employees and caring family members while concealing homicidal tendencies. Dr. Reeves wanted to understand Carmen's relationship with me and how she'd gained such complete control over my life. During our conversation, I began to see patterns I'd missed before. Carmen had used techniques common to abusive relationships: isolation, gaslighting, creating dependency, and gradually escalating control. She'd been patient, taking months to establish trust before beginning the systematic abuse. The financial investigation revealed the full extent of Carmen's theft from my accounts. Beyond the $40,000 in direct withdrawals, she'd used my credit cards for personal purchases, taken cash advances, and even attempted to secure a line of credit against my house. The total loss was estimated at over $60,000, money that would likely never be recovered even if Carmen were convicted. My attorney, James Morrison, who specialized in elder law, helped me understand the process of recovering what assets we could and protecting myself from future financial abuse. He recommended changes to my banking arrangements, updated estate planning documents, and security measures to prevent anyone from gaining unauthorized access to my accounts again. Morrison also helped me understand my rights as a victim in the federal case. I would be entitled to restitution if Carmen were convicted, though he warned me that most criminals in these situations had spent the stolen money and had no assets to recover. More importantly, I had the right to provide a victim impact statement at sentencing, an opportunity to tell the court directly how Carmen's crimes had affected my life. The psychological impact of Carmen's betrayal proved more difficult to address than the financial losses. Beth referred me to Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who specialized in treating victims of intimate partner violence and elder abuse. Dr. Chen helped me understand that the trauma I'd experienced was complex, involving not just the physical effects of being drugged, but the emotional devastation of being deceived by someone I'd loved and trusted. During our sessions, Dr. Chen helped me process the guilt I felt about being victimized. I kept asking myself how I could have been so naive, so trusting, so easily manipulated. She helped me understand that Carmen had specifically targeted me during a period of grief and vulnerability, using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that would have deceived most people in my situation. The therapy sessions also helped me recognize the strength I'd shown in eventually identifying the threat and seeking help. Dr. Chen pointed out that many victims of this type of abuse never realize what's happening to them, remaining under their abuser's control until death. My ability to recognize the signs, despite being heavily sedated, and take action to protect myself was remarkable. One of the most difficult aspects of recovery was rebuilding my relationship with Daniel. Carmen had poisoned his perception of me so thoroughly that he'd begun making plans for my long-term care based on her reports of my declining mental state. The guilt he felt about believing her over his own observations was eating away at him, and I found myself in the strange position of comforting him about my own victimization. Daniel had taken time off work to stay with me during the first weeks after Carmen's arrest, and slowly we began to rebuild the trust and communication that her manipulation had damaged. He told me about conversations with Carmen, where she'd convinced him that my confusion and memory problems were symptoms of early Alzheimer's disease. She'd even suggested that he might want to consider having me evaluated for involuntary commitment if my condition worsened. The realization that Carmen had been positioning herself to have me declared incompetent was terrifying. If her plan had succeeded, she would have gained legal control over all my affairs while I was locked away in a facility, unable to communicate or advocate for myself. The documents found in her room suggested she'd researched the legal process for having elderly people declared mentally incompetent, studying how to manipulate the system to serve her purposes. Detective Santos arranged for me to speak with other victims of Carmen's crimes, families whose elderly relatives had died under suspicious circumstances at Willowbrook. These conversations were heartbreaking, but also validating. I heard stories remarkably similar to my own: sudden cognitive decline, unexplained financial irregularities, and Carmen's constant presence as the concerned caregiver who seemed to be the only one who truly understood their loved one's needs. One woman, Margaret Foster, told me about her mother's death 6 months before Carmen moved in with me. Her 84-year-old mother had been recovering well from hip surgery when Carmen began working her case. Within weeks, the woman became confused and lethargic, stopped eating, and died within a month. Carmen had been the last person to see her alive, bringing her evening medications as she did for all her patients. Margaret had requested an autopsy because her mother's decline seemed so sudden and unexpected. The results showed lethal levels of insulin in her system, despite the fact that she wasn't diabetic. Carmen had access to insulin through her work and had apparently used it to induce fatal hypoglycemia in her victim. The death had been ruled suspicious, but investigators hadn't had enough evidence to file charges until my case brought Carmen to their attention. Another family shared a similar story about their 79-year-old father, who had been healthy except for mild arthritis when Carmen became his primary caregiver. He'd become increasingly drowsy and confused, stopped recognizing family members, and died in his sleep after only 6 weeks under Carmen's care. His family had been told he'd suffered a series of small strokes, but now investigators were re-examining his case with the knowledge of Carmen's methods. These conversations helped me understand that I wasn't just a random victim but part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior. Carmen had been systematically identifying vulnerable elderly people, gaining access to them through her position at Willowbrook, then either stealing from them or killing them depending on her assessment of their potential value to her. The federal investigation expanded to include authorities in other states where Carmen had previously worked. Her employment history showed a pattern of moving from facility to facility, often leaving after unexplained deaths or financial irregularities. In each location, she'd been considered a model employee right up until the moment she disappeared, leaving behind suspicious circumstances that were often not investigated until much later. Walsh updated me on the prosecution's strategy as the case moved forward. They were planning to present evidence of Carmen's entire pattern of criminal behavior, not just her crimes against me. This approach would help establish that her actions were premeditated and part of a systematic scheme rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. The prosecution had also secured cooperation from several of Carmen's former colleagues at Willowbrook, who had become suspicious of her behavior. One nurse reported that Carmen had always volunteered to work with the most vulnerable patients, particularly those without active family involvement. Another had noticed that Carmen seemed to have unusual access to medications that should have been more carefully controlled. Dr. Michael Torres, the head pharmacist at Willowbrook, provided testimony about discrepancies in medication counts that coincided with Carmen's shifts. The facility's computerized tracking system showed patterns of missing drugs that investigators could now tie directly to Carmen's patient assignments. She'd been clever about covering her tracks, but not perfect, and the evidence against her was mounting daily. As the weeks passed and my system completely cleared of Carmen's sedatives, I began to experience unexpected emotional reactions. Sometimes I would find myself crying for no apparent reason, grieving not just for what I'd lost but for the trust I'd given so freely to someone who'd used it to harm me. Other times I felt waves of anger so intense they frightened me, rage at Carmen's calculated cruelty and at my own vulnerability. Dr. Chen helped me understand that these emotional swings were normal parts of trauma recovery. The months of chemical suppression had affected not just my cognitive function but my emotional processing as well. As my brain chemistry returned to normal, I was experiencing delayed reactions to events that had occurred while I was too sedated to fully comprehend them. The anger, Dr. Chen explained, was actually a healthy sign of recovery. It meant I was reclaiming my sense of personal agency and rejecting the helplessness that Carmen had tried to impose on me. The tears were my psyche's way of processing grief for the months of my life that had been stolen, the trust that had been violated, and the innocence about human nature that I could never fully recover. One unexpected challenge was dealing with well-meaning friends and neighbors who wanted to know what had happened. Word had spread through our small community about Carmen's arrest, and people were curious about the details. Some approached the subject with genuine concern and support, but others seemed more interested in gossip than in my well-being. I found it particularly difficult when people expressed surprise that someone like Carmen could have fooled me so completely. Comments like, quote, "I always thought there was something off about her," or "you should have been more careful," stung deeply, even when I knew they weren't intended to blame me. The implication that I should have somehow known better made me feel foolish and defensive. Beth helped me develop strategies for dealing with these interactions. We practiced responses that acknowledged people's concerns while protecting my privacy and emotional well-being. I learned to say things like, "It's been difficult, but I'm getting stronger every day," or "The legal process is ongoing, so I can't discuss details, but I appreciate your support." The media attention was another unexpected challenge. Local news outlets picked up the story when Carmen was arrested, and it eventually caught the attention of regional and even national news organizations. The angle of a trusted caregiver systematically poisoning an elderly woman made for compelling headlines, but it also meant photographers camping outside my house and reporters calling at all hours. Morrison helped me issue a statement through his office requesting privacy while the legal proceedings were ongoing. Most legitimate news organizations respected this request, but I still had to deal with tabloid reporters and true crime bloggers who were less scrupulous about respecting boundaries. I ended up changing my phone number and installing a security system to help me feel safer in my own home. The investigation into Carmen's financial crimes revealed sophisticated techniques that went far beyond simple theft. She'd used my personal information to open credit accounts in my name, purchased expensive items online that she'd had delivered to post office boxes, and even attempted to use my identity to secure loans against property I owned. Federal investigators found evidence that Carmen had been planning to fake my death and assume my identity to access life insurance benefits and sell my house. She'd researched how to obtain false identification documents and had been in contact with people who specialized in identity theft schemes. The scope of her plans was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications for what my fate would have been. The psychological evaluation of Carmen conducted by Dr. Reeves revealed a profile consistent with psychopathic personality disorder. Carmen showed no genuine remorse for her victims, viewing them instead as resources to be exploited. She'd developed elaborate justifications for her behavior, claiming that elderly people who were going to die anyway might as well be useful in their final months. Dr. Reeves explained that Carmen likely saw herself as superior to her victims, deserving of their resources because she was younger and more capable. This sense of entitlement, combined with her complete lack of empathy, had allowed her to commit increasingly serious crimes without experiencing normal feelings of guilt or moral constraint. The defense team's strategy became clearer as the case progressed toward trial. They were planning to argue that Carmen suffered from a personality disorder that diminished her capacity to understand the wrongfulness of her actions. They would also claim that her difficult childhood and history of being victimized herself had created psychological damage that explained her criminal behavior. Walsh prepared me for the likelihood that Carmen's attorneys would try to portray her as a victim of circumstances, rather than a calculating predator. They might argue that she'd been trying to help me by managing my finances, and that the sedatives were meant to ease my anxiety rather than control me. This strategy would require me to testify clearly and convincingly about my experiences under her care. The prospect of facing Carmen in court was both terrifying and empowering. Part of me was afraid of seeing her again, worried that she might still have some psychological hold over me, but a larger part of me was eager for the opportunity to confront her directly, to look her in the eye and tell her exactly how her actions had affected my life. As the trial date approached, I worked with Dr. Chen on strategies for managing my anxiety and staying focused during testimony. We practiced techniques for staying grounded when difficult memories surfaced, and for speaking clearly about traumatic experiences without becoming overwhelmed by emotion. The victim advocate assigned to my case, Linda Marshall, helped me understand what to expect during the trial process. She explained that I would likely be questioned not just about Carmen's crimes against me, but about my mental state before, during, and after the abuse. The defense would try to suggest that my memory of events was unreliable due to my age and the effects of the medication. Marshall also prepared me for the possibility that Carmen might try to communicate with me during the trial, either through facial expressions or notes passed through her attorneys. She warned me that psychopathic individuals often tried to manipulate their victims even from the defendant's table, using subtle intimidation or false shows of remorse to influence testimony. The financial recovery process was slow and frustrating. Even though Carmen's guilt was evident, actually getting back the money she'd stolen required navigating complex legal procedures. Some of the fraudulent transactions were covered by bank insurance, but others required me to prove that I hadn't authorized them, a difficult task when my signature appeared on many of the documents. Morrison filed a civil lawsuit against Carmen seeking recovery of all my losses plus punitive damages, but he warned me that even if we won a substantial judgment, collecting on it would be nearly impossible. Carmen had spent most of the money she'd stolen and had no significant assets that could be seized to satisfy a court order. The civil case also named Willowbrook Care Center as a defendant, arguing that they'd been negligent in supervising Carmen and allowing her access to medications she'd used to harm patients. This aspect of the lawsuit had better prospects for recovery, since the facility had insurance coverage for employee misconduct, though their attorneys were fighting the claims vigorously. As I prepared for the upcoming trial, I found myself reflecting on how fundamentally the experience had changed me. The woman who'd welcomed Carmen into her home with such trust and gratitude was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, more suspicious, more aware of the potential for evil that could hide behind a caring facade. This change wasn't entirely negative. I'd discovered reserves of strength and resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. The experience of fighting for my life against such overwhelming odds had shown me that I was far more capable than I'd realized. Even in my 70s, even while being systematically poisoned, I'd managed to recognize the threat and take action to save myself. The support I'd received from Beth, Dr. Chen, Detective Santos, and others had also revealed the existence of good people who were willing to help when help was needed. For every Carmen who sought to exploit vulnerability, there were others who dedicated their lives to protecting the vulnerable and seeking justice for those who'd been harmed. The trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, and I was as ready as I could be to face Carmen across a courtroom and tell the world what she'd done to me. The physical effects of her poisoning had faded, but the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. Still, I was alive, I was free, and I was determined to see justice done not just for myself but for all of Carmen's victims who would never have the chance to tell their stories. The courthouse steps felt steeper than they should have. As I climbed them on the morning of Carmen's trial, Daniel walked beside me, his hand hovering protectively near my elbow without actually touching, a gesture that spoke to how much our relationship had shifted since Carmen's arrest. Behind us, Linda Marshall carried a folder containing my victim impact statement, the words I'd spent weeks crafting to explain the true cost of Carmen's betrayal. The federal courthouse was an imposing building of gray stone and tall windows, designed to convey the weight of justice being dispensed within its walls. As we passed through security, I caught sight of other families who'd been affected by Carmen's crimes. Margaret Foster, whose mother had died from the insulin overdose, nodded at me with the grim solidarity shared by those who'd survived similar traumas. Her presence reminded me that this trial wasn't just about my suffering, but about a pattern of destruction that had touched dozens of lives. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh met us in the hallway outside the courtroom, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth as she explained the day's proceedings. The trial was expected to last 2 weeks, with the prosecution presenting evidence of Carmen's systematic abuse of elderly victims across multiple states. My testimony would come early, Walsh explained, while my memories were fresh and before the defense could muddy the waters with their psychological explanations. The courtroom itself was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling that gave it an almost intimate feeling, despite the gravity of what would unfold there. As I took my seat in the gallery, I forced myself to look at the defendant's table where Carmen would soon sit. The woman who'd held such power over my life, who'd controlled my thoughts and actions through carefully administered chemicals, would finally face judgment for her crimes. When Carmen entered the courtroom flanked by her defense attorneys, I felt a jolt of recognition followed immediately by revulsion. She'd lost weight during her months in federal detention, and her once perfectly styled hair hung limp around her shoulders. But what struck me most was the calculating way her eyes swept the gallery, cataloging faces and reactions with the same clinical detachment she'd shown while documenting my decline in her notebook. Her gaze found mine across the courtroom, and for a moment we stared at each other directly. I'd worried that seeing her again might trigger some remnant of the psychological control she'd exercised over me, but instead I felt only a cold clarity. This was the woman who'd sat beside my bed, stroking my hair while poison coursed through my veins. This was the predator who'd worn the mask of a caring daughter-in-law while planning my death. Any lingering traces of affection or confusion vanished under the weight of that recognition. Judge Patricia Hawkins called the court to order, with an authority that immediately commanded attention. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. As she reviewed the charges against Carmen, her voice carried the measured cadence of someone who'd presided over countless cases, but still took each one seriously. The list of charges was staggering in its scope. Federal counts of elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, and drug trafficking were joined by state charges of attempted murder, theft, and forgery. Additional charges related to the deaths at Willowbrook were still pending as investigators continued building those cases. Carmen sat motionless as each count was read, her expression blank except for the occasional glance toward her attorneys. Walsh's opening statement painted a picture of systematic predation that was both comprehensive and chilling. She described Carmen as a woman who'd turned caregiving into a weapon, using her position of trust to identify vulnerable victims and exploit them with calculated precision. The prosecutor outlined how Carmen had refined her techniques over years, learning from each victim how to better control the next one. The evidence Walsh described was overwhelming. Bank records showing fraudulent transactions, medical records documenting unexplained sedation, surveillance footage from Willowbrook showing Carmen diverting medications, and most damning of all, Carmen's own notebooks detailing her methods and plans. The prosecution would show that Carmen hadn't been a caregiver who'd made poor decisions, but a predator who'd used healthcare as cover for systematic abuse. Carmen's defense attorney, Robert Klein, presented a starkly different narrative in his opening statement. He acknowledged that Carmen had made serious mistakes, but argued that she'd been motivated by genuine concern for her elderly charges rather than malicious intent. Klein painted Carmen as a woman who'd been traumatized by her own difficult childhood and had developed an unhealthy need to control situations in order to feel safe. Klein's strategy became clear as he described Carmen's history of abuse at the hands of her own family members. He argued that her actions toward elderly patients represented a misguided attempt to protect them from the kind of suffering she'd experienced. The sedatives she'd administered were meant to ease anxiety and confusion, not to facilitate theft or murder. Her financial crimes, Klein claimed, were desperate attempts to secure resources for better care for her patients. I found Klein's characterization of Carmen almost offensive in its manipulation of sympathy. He was asking the jury to see her as a victim of circumstances, rather than the architect of a systematic scheme to exploit the vulnerable. The suggestion that her crimes stemmed from a desire to help rather than harm seemed designed to minimize the very real damage she'd inflicted on dozens of lives. My testimony was scheduled for the second day of trial, and I spent the evening before reviewing my notes and practicing with Dr. Chen's relaxation techniques. The victim advocate had prepared me for the likelihood that Klein would try to suggest my memory was unreliable due to my age and the effects of the medication, but I felt confident in my ability to describe what I'd experienced clearly and accurately. Walking to the witness stand the next morning, I was acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom following my movement. Carmen watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and calculation. Her attorneys whispered among themselves, no doubt preparing their strategy for cross-examination. But I focused on Walsh, whose encouraging nod reminded me that I was there to tell the truth about what had happened to me. Walsh's direct examination began with basic questions about my background and relationship with Carmen. I described how she'd come into our family, how she'd moved in after Robert's death, and how I'd initially been grateful for her care and attention. Walsh guided me through the timeline of my increasing symptoms, asking me to describe in detail how the sedatives had affected my daily life. Testifying about the months of drugging was more difficult than I'd expected. Describing the confusion, the memory loss, the way Carmen had systematically stripped away my independence, brought back feelings of helplessness I'd worked hard to overcome. But I also felt a sense of empowerment in finally being able to speak publicly about what had been done to me, to name Carmen's actions for what they truly were. Walsh showed me evidence recovered from my house, including the notebook where Carmen had documented my reactions to different doses of medication. Reading excerpts from those clinical observations in open court was profoundly disturbing. Carmen had written about me like I was a laboratory specimen rather than a human being, noting when I was too alert or when I needed additional management, with the same detachment she might have used to describe adjusting a thermostat. The financial evidence was equally damning when Walsh walked me through bank statements showing the fraudulent transactions. Seeing my forged signature on document after document drove home how completely Carmen had assumed control over my life. She'd signed my name to authorize her own theft, using skills she'd presumably developed through years of manipulating elderly victims. Klein's cross-examination began aggressively, with questions clearly designed to undermine my credibility as a witness. He asked repeatedly about my age, my grief over Robert's death, and my memory of events that had occurred while I was being sedated. His tone was respectful enough to avoid alienating the jury, but the implications of his questions were clear. I was an elderly woman whose recollection of events might be unreliable. I'd prepared for this line of attack and responded calmly to each question. When Klein suggested that my symptoms might have been related to natural aging rather than drugging, I pointed out that the medical tests had confirmed the presence of sedatives I'd never been prescribed. When he implied that I might have consented to Carmen managing my finances, I reminded him of the forged signatures and unauthorized transactions that no reasonable person would have approved. Klein's most aggressive moment came when he suggested that I might have been exaggerating Carmen's control over my life because I was embarrassed about needing help. His question was clearly designed to make me defensive, but instead it crystallized my anger at the entire situation. I looked directly at him and said that the only thing I was embarrassed about was trusting someone who'd used that trust to nearly kill me. The prosecutor's redirect examination gave me a chance to clarify points Klein had tried to muddy and to emphasize the systematic nature of Carmen's abuse. Walsh asked me to describe how my mental clarity had returned almost immediately after Carmen's arrest, a recovery that would have been impossible if my symptoms had been caused by natural cognitive decline rather than chemical sedation. As I left the witness stand, I felt drained but also relieved. I had told my story completely and honestly, and I believed the jury had heard the truth about what Carmen had done to me. Looking back at the defendant's table, I saw Carmen whispering urgently to Klein, her composure finally showing cracks as she realized how damaging my testimony had been. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from other victims and their families. Margaret Foster described her mother's rapid decline and unexpected death, her voice breaking as she recalled how Carmen had been the last person to see her mother alive. The medical examiner who'd performed the autopsy testified about the lethal levels of insulin found in the woman's system, insulin that Carmen had diverted from the nursing home's supplies. Dr. Torres, the pharmacist from Willowbrook, provided detailed testimony about the missing medications and how they correlated with Carmen's work schedule. His computerized tracking data showed a clear pattern of drugs disappearing when Carmen was assigned to vulnerable patients, evidence that demolished any claim that her access to these substances had been coincidental. The financial crimes expert who'd analyzed Carmen's theft techniques painted a picture of sophisticated fraud that went far beyond opportunistic stealing. Carmen had studied her victims carefully, identifying their banking habits, their family relationships, and their cognitive vulnerabilities before beginning her systematic exploitation. She'd developed a reproducible method for gaining financial control over elderly victims while keeping them too sedated to understand what was happening. Detective Santos testified about the evidence recovered from my house, including the timeline Carmen had created for my expected death and the draft obituaries she'd written in advance. The detective's clinical description of these documents sent a visible shudder through the courtroom as jurors realized how close Carmen had come to successfully murdering me while making it appear natural. The prosecution's expert witness on elder abuse, Dr. Linda Harrison, provided context for Carmen's crimes within the broader pattern of institutional abuse of elderly people. Dr. Harrison explained how predators like Carmen specifically targeted the healthcare industry because it provided access to vulnerable victims and the medical knowledge needed to harm them without detection. Dr. Harrison's testimony was particularly powerful when she described the psychological impact of being victimized by a trusted caregiver. She explained that elderly people who were abused by those they depended on often suffered trauma that went far beyond the immediate physical harm, losing their ability to trust their own judgment and their confidence in seeking help from others. The defense case began with character witnesses who testified about Carmen's dedication to her work and her reputation as a caring employee. Several colleagues from Willowbrook described her as someone who always volunteered for the most difficult cases and who seemed genuinely concerned about her patients' well-being. These witnesses painted a picture of someone who might have made poor decisions but whose motivations were fundamentally good. Klein also presented testimony about Carmen's troubled childhood, including records of abuse and neglect that had apparently shaped her psychological development. A forensic psychologist testified that Carmen suffered from trauma-related disorders that could have impaired her judgment and created an unhealthy need to control her environment. This psychological testimony was clearly designed to generate sympathy for Carmen and to suggest that her crimes were the result of mental illness rather than calculated evil. The expert described how childhood trauma could create adults who sought to prevent suffering in others by exerting extreme control, even when that control became harmful. Carmen herself took the stand in her own defense, a risky strategy that Klein had apparently decided was necessary given the overwhelming evidence against her. Her testimony was carefully scripted, focusing on her genuine care for elderly patients and her belief that she was helping them by managing their anxiety and confusion through medication. Carmen described me as someone who'd been suffering greatly after Robert's death, unable to care for myself properly, and becoming increasingly confused and agitated. She claimed that the sedatives she'd given me were meant to ease my emotional pain and help me sleep better, not to facilitate theft or control. Her financial crimes, she insisted, had been desperate attempts to secure resources for my care that she couldn't afford on her salary. Watching Carmen testify was surreal, in a way I hadn't anticipated. She spoke about me with apparent affection, describing how much she'd cared about my well-being, and how difficult it had been to watch me struggle with grief and aging. To someone who didn't know the truth, she might have sounded like a devoted daughter-in-law who'd made some poor choices while trying to help. But I could see through her performance, to the calculating intelligence beneath, the way she paused before answering difficult questions, the slight changes in her expression when she thought no one was watching, the occasional glances toward the jury to gauge their reactions. This was the same woman who'd sat beside my bed documenting my decline with clinical detachment, and no amount of coached testimony could completely hide that predatory nature. Walsh's cross-examination of Carmen was masterful in its methodical destruction of her claims. The prosecutor walked Carmen through her notebook entries, asking her to explain why someone genuinely concerned about a patient's well-being would write things like, "Subject becoming suspicious, requires additional management," or "increased dosage to maintain compliance." Carmen struggled to explain away these entries, falling back on vague claims about medical terminology and the need to document patient behavior. But Walsh pressed her on the specific language she'd used, the calculations for drug dosages, and the timeline she'd created for my expected death. Under sustained questioning, Carmen's composure began to crack, revealing flashes of the cold intelligence that had enabled her crimes. The most damaging moment of Carmen's cross-examination came when Walsh confronted her with evidence of similar patterns in her treatment of other victims. Carmen couldn't explain why multiple elderly patients under her care had experienced identical symptoms, why the same medications had gone missing whenever she worked certain floors, or why she'd used nearly identical methods to gain financial control over different victims. Walsh's final questions focused on the draft obituaries found in Carmen's room, documents that Carmen struggled to explain away. Her claim that she'd been trying to help me prepare for the possibility of death fell apart when Walsh pointed out that the obituaries were written in past tense and contained false information about the circumstances of my supposed death. The closing arguments crystallized the fundamental disagreement between prosecution and defense about Carmen's motivations and mental state. Walsh argued that the evidence showed a sophisticated predator who'd used her healthcare training to systematically exploit vulnerable victims over a period of years. The prosecutor emphasized the planning and calculation evident in Carmen's crimes, the progression from theft to attempted murder, and the complete lack of genuine remorse for the harm she'd caused. Klein's closing argument focused heavily on Carmen's troubled background and psychological disorders, asking the jury to consider whether someone with her history of trauma could truly be held fully responsible for her actions. He acknowledged that Carmen had committed serious crimes, but argued that they stemmed from mental illness rather than evil intent, warranting treatment rather than lengthy imprisonment. The jury deliberated for 3 days, a period during which I found myself unable to focus on anything else. Walsh had warned me that the psychological defense might resonate with some jurors, particularly if they were reluctant to impose harsh sentences on someone with a history of being victimized herself. The complexity of the charges and the volume of evidence also meant that deliberations might take considerable time. When the call came that the jury had reached a verdict, I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that made it difficult to breathe normally. Daniel drove me to the courthouse, both of us maintaining a nervous silence during the short trip. Linda Marshall met us at the entrance, her expression carefully neutral as she explained that we couldn't predict the outcome based on the length of deliberations. The courtroom was packed as Judge Hawkins called for the verdict to be read. Carmen stood between her attorneys, her face pale but composed, as the jury foreman rose to announce their decisions. The first count, elder abuse in the first degree, brought a verdict of guilty that sent a visible shudder through Carmen's shoulders. The second count, attempted murder, guilty. Fraud, guilty. Identity theft, guilty. Count after count brought the same result until Carmen was convicted on all 23 charges against her. The moment the final guilty verdict was read, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Justice hadn't brought back the months Carmen had stolen from me or erased the trauma she'd inflicted, but it had officially recognized the reality of what she'd done and held her accountable for it. Looking across the courtroom, I saw other victims and family members crying with relief that their loved ones' suffering had finally been acknowledged. Carmen's reaction to the verdicts was strangely muted. She seemed to deflate, rather than collapse, as if some internal structure that had been holding her together had simply dissolved. Her attorneys immediately began discussing appeals and sentencing strategies, but Carmen herself appeared almost detached from the proceedings, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments about the appropriate punishment for Carmen's crimes. Walsh explained that federal sentencing guidelines called for a substantial prison term, likely decades, given the severity and scope of Carmen's offenses. The murder charges related to the Willowbrook deaths would be tried separately, but could result in additional life sentences. The victim impact statements would be a crucial part of the sentencing hearing, giving those of us who'd been harmed by Carmen's actions a chance to speak directly to the judge about how her crimes had affected our lives. I spent considerable time crafting my statement, trying to capture not just the immediate harm she'd caused, but the longer-term impact on my ability to trust others and feel secure in my own home. During the weeks between conviction and sentencing, I found myself processing the trial experience and what it meant for my recovery. Testifying had been difficult but also empowering, giving me a chance to speak publicly about what had been done to me and to see Carmen held accountable for her actions. The guilty verdicts had validated my experience and confirmed that I hadn't been imagining or exaggerating the abuse I'd suffered. The sentencing hearing brought many of the same people back to the courthouse, victims and family members united in our desire to see justice fully served. Judge Hawkins had clearly spent considerable time reviewing the evidence and preparing for what would be one of the most significant sentences she'd impose. Her reputation for thoughtful but firm justice had given us confidence that Carmen would receive appropriate punishment. Walsh presented the prosecution's sentencing recommendation first, arguing that Carmen's crimes warranted the maximum possible penalty under federal guidelines. The prosecutor emphasized the premeditated nature of the offenses, the vulnerability of the victims, and the complete absence of genuine remorse from the defendant. Walsh also noted that Carmen's position as a healthcare worker made her crimes particularly egregious, representing a fundamental betrayal of professional trust. The victim impact statements began with Margaret Foster, whose mother had died from Carmen's insulin overdose. Margaret's voice shook as she described watching her healthy mother decline rapidly under Carmen's care, the family's confusion about the sudden deterioration, and their ongoing grief at losing someone who should have lived many more years. She looked directly at Carmen as she spoke, demanding that the woman who'd killed her mother acknowledge the human cost of her actions. When my turn came to address the court, I felt surprisingly calm despite the magnitude of the moment. I'd practiced my statement many times, but standing before Judge Hawkins with Carmen seated just a few feet away, the words I'd prepared seemed inadequate to capture the full scope of what I'd endured. Instead, I spoke from my heart about the months of confusion and fear, the systematic stripping away of my independence, and the terror of realizing that someone I'd trusted completely had been slowly killing me. I told the judge about waking up each morning during those months, feeling like I was drowning, unable to understand why my mind wouldn't work properly, or why simple tasks had become impossible. I described the guilt I'd felt about being a burden on my family, not knowing that Carmen was deliberately creating the symptoms that made me appear incompetent. Most importantly, I explained how Carmen's betrayal had damaged not just my body but my ability to trust my own judgment and to feel safe accepting help from others. Looking at Carmen as I spoke, I saw no sign of genuine remorse or understanding of the harm she'd caused. Her expression remained blank, almost bored, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. That lack of empathy, more than anything else, convinced me that she remained dangerous and would continue to harm vulnerable people if given the opportunity. Other victims and family members shared similar stories of betrayal, loss, and ongoing trauma. The cumulative impact of these statements was powerful, painting a picture of systematic predation that had destroyed lives and shattered families across multiple states. Judge Hawkins listened intently to each statement, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she understood the broader implications of Carmen's crimes. Klein's sentencing argument focused on Carmen's mental health issues and argued for a sentence that would emphasize treatment rather than pure punishment. He presented evidence of Carmen's childhood trauma and suggested that her crimes were the result of untreated psychological disorders that could be addressed through intensive therapy. Klein asked the judge to consider a sentence that would give Carmen a chance at rehabilitation rather than condemning her to die in prison. The defense also presented letters from Carmen's family members and friends, describing her as someone who'd been genuinely caring and helpful before her apparent psychological breakdown. These character references painted a picture of someone who'd been damaged by her experiences rather than inherently evil, someone who might be able to contribute positively to society if given appropriate treatment. Judge Hawkins took a brief recess before delivering her sentence, using the time to review the extensive documentation and consider the arguments from both sides. When court reconvened, her demeanor was grave as she began to explain her reasoning for the sentence she was about to impose. The judge acknowledged Carmen's difficult background and mental health issues, but emphasized that these factors couldn't excuse the calculated nature of her crimes or the devastating harm she'd inflicted on vulnerable victims. Judge Hawkins noted that Carmen had used her professional training and position of trust to commit offenses that struck at the heart of society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members. The sentence Judge Hawkins imposed was severe: 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for the first 25 years. Additional state sentences for the murder charges would run consecutively, meaning Carmen would likely spend the rest of her life in prison. The judge also ordered full restitution to all victims, though she acknowledged that the financial recovery was unlikely given Carmen's lack of assets. Carmen's reaction to the sentence was minimal, just a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the reality was finally penetrating her detachment. Her attorneys immediately announced their intention to appeal, but the evidence had been so overwhelming that success seemed unlikely. As the bailiffs led Carmen away in shackles, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected challenges as I worked to rebuild my life and identity. The national media attention had made my story widely known, resulting in contact from other elderly people who suspected they might be victims of similar abuse. Working with Detective Santos and victim advocacy groups, I began speaking about elder abuse awareness, using my experience to help others recognize the warning signs of systematic exploitation. Daniel and I continued working to repair our relationship, both of us grappling with guilt about how completely Carmen had deceived us. Family therapy helped us understand that we'd both been victims of sophisticated manipulation, and that recognizing Carmen's true nature earlier might have been impossible given her skills at deception. The financial recovery process continued for months after sentencing, with investigators working to identify and reclaim assets that Carmen had stolen or hidden. While the monetary losses were significant, the insurance settlements and victim compensation funds eventually covered most of the direct financial harm. The emotional recovery proved more complex and ongoing. Dr. Chen continued working with me on processing the trauma and rebuilding my sense of security and autonomy. We focused on strategies for evaluating new relationships carefully without becoming so suspicious that I couldn't accept legitimate help when needed. Learning to trust my own judgment again after months of systematic gaslighting was one of the most difficult aspects of recovery. The civil lawsuit against Willowbrook Care Center eventually resulted in a substantial settlement that provided resources for enhanced security measures and ongoing support for elder abuse victims. The facility implemented new protocols for medication management and employee supervision, changes that might prevent future predators from operating with Carmen's level of access and autonomy. 6 months after Carmen's sentencing, I received a letter from her in prison, the first and only communication she'd attempted since her arrest. The letter contained what appeared to be an apology, expressing regret for the pain she'd caused and claiming that she'd genuinely cared about me despite her actions. Reading it, I could see the same manipulative techniques she'd used during our relationship, the careful construction of phrases designed to evoke sympathy and forgiveness. I showed the letter to Dr. Chen, who helped me understand it as another attempt at control rather than genuine remorse. Carmen was trying to maintain some form of connection and influence even from prison, possibly hoping to manipulate me into supporting her appeals or providing character references for future parole hearings. I never responded to the letter, and when others arrived over the following months, I had them forwarded directly to my attorney without reading them. The experience of surviving Carmen's systematic abuse and seeing her brought to justice had fundamentally changed my perspective on vulnerability and strength. I'd learned that being targeted by a predator didn't reflect any weakness or failing on my part, but that recognizing and responding to that threat had revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed. Working with other elder abuse survivors had shown me that my experience, while traumatic, was part of a larger pattern of exploitation that affected thousands of elderly people every year. Many victims never recognized what was happening to them, never found the courage to seek help, or never encountered people willing to believe and support them. My survival and successful prosecution of Carmen had made me an advocate for others facing similar situations. The house where Carmen had systematically poisoned me for months eventually felt like home again, though it took considerable time and effort to reclaim each room from the memories of her presence. I'd considered selling and moving somewhere without those associations, but ultimately decided that leaving would give Carmen's influence over my life a permanence I refused to accept. Instead, I redecorated extensively, replacing furniture and belongings that carried negative associations with items that reflected my own tastes and preferences. The kitchen where she'd prepared my nightly doses of sedatives became a place where I cooked meals for friends and family, reclaiming it from its role in my victimization. The garden where Robert and I had spent so many happy hours became a particular focus of my recovery. Working with my hands in the soil, nurturing plants and watching them grow, provided a powerful counterbalance to the months of feeling helpless and controlled. Each season brought new growth and renewed life, metaphors that resonated deeply with my own process of healing and renewal. Daniel's relationship with me continued to evolve, as we both processed the impact of Carmen's deception on our family. He'd struggled with enormous guilt about believing Carmen's reports of my declining mental state, rather than trusting his own observations and instincts. Family therapy helped him understand that Carmen had been using sophisticated manipulation techniques that would have deceived most people in his situation. Our renewed closeness became one of the unexpected positive outcomes of surviving Carmen's abuse. The crisis had forced us to communicate more honestly about our fears, needs, and expectations than we had in years. While I never wanted to experience such trauma again, I was grateful for the strengthened relationship with my son that had emerged from working through it together. Beth remained a close friend and informal advisor as I navigated the ongoing challenges of recovery. Her medical expertise had been crucial in identifying the drugging and supporting my case against Carmen, but her friendship had been equally important in maintaining my emotional stability throughout the ordeal. She often reminded me that surviving what Carmen had done to me was itself a remarkable achievement that spoke to my inner strength and resilience. The victim advocacy work I'd begun during the trial continued to be an important part of my life in the months and years that followed. Speaking at conferences about elder abuse, working with law enforcement to identify warning signs, and supporting other victims through their recovery became ways of transforming my traumatic experience into something that could help protect others. Each time I shared my story, I was struck by how many people approached me afterward to describe their own concerns about elderly relatives who might be experiencing similar abuse. The systematic nature of Carmen's crimes wasn't unique. Predators across the country were using similar techniques to exploit vulnerable elderly people, often with devastating results. Working with Detective Santos and federal investigators, I helped develop training materials that could teach healthcare workers, bank employees, and family members to recognize signs of systematic elder abuse. The patterns Carmen had used were reproducible and identifiable once people knew what to look for, but education and awareness were crucial for effective prevention. 2 years after Carmen's sentencing, I received notice that she died in federal prison, apparently from complications related to a chronic medical condition. My reaction to this news surprised me. Rather than satisfaction or relief, I felt a kind of emptiness. Carmen's death meant that the appeals process would end and that she'd never have another opportunity to harm elderly victims. But it also meant that any possibility of her developing genuine understanding of the damage she'd caused died with her. The notification of Carmen's death came with information about her final months in prison. According to the reports, she'd continued to maintain her innocence and had been working on writing what she claimed would be a book about systematic failures in elder care that had led to her wrongful conviction. Even facing decades in prison, she'd apparently never developed genuine insight into her crimes or empathy for her victims. In some ways, Carmen's death provided a final closure to the chapter of my life that she'd dominated through her systematic abuse and the subsequent legal proceedings. She could never again manipulate vulnerable elderly people, never again use her healthcare knowledge to harm those who trusted her care, never again write clinical observations about someone's decline while planning their death. Looking back on the entire experience from the perspective of several years, I could see how completely it had transformed my understanding of human nature my approach to relationships, and my sense of my own capabilities. The woman who'd trusted Carmen so completely, who'd been grateful for her apparent care and attention, had been naive in ways that seemed almost foreign to me now. The woman I'd become was more cautious, more aware of the potential for evil that could hide behind caring facades, more protective of my independence and autonomy. But I was also more confident in my own judgment, more aware of my inner strength, and more committed to using my experience to help others avoid similar victimization. The garden outside my kitchen window, where Robert and I had planted roses decades earlier, continued to bloom each spring with renewed vigor. Like those perennial flowers that survived harsh winters and emerged stronger each year, I'd endured Carmen's systematic attempt to destroy me and had grown back more resilient than before. The scars of her abuse would always be part of my history, but they no longer defined my future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.